Hi, everyone. Welcome. So glad to see you. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Ching-Yi Chen. I'm faculty in the Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this talk and conversation with Peter Bacho this afternoon as part of the University of Washington Bothell Labor Colloquium. I'm just going to talk a little bit about logistics before we get started. I'm going to ask everyone to please mute during the talk. And if you forget to mute and have a lot of background noise, we may mute you directly. If you have any tech or access needs, our access and tech needs support person today will be Atlanta Duncan. And so if you need anything along those lines, please feel free to message Atlanta. And if you can't get a hold of Atlanta, please message me directly in the chat, not our guest speaker. And I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Labor Stories During Pandemic Times class, the From the Convergence Zone reading series, and the Harry Bridges Center. This talk is going to be recorded and available at a later date in the UW-Bothell Labor Colloquium and MFA archives. So after the talk, we're going to open up to a bit of conversation with the audience, which I'm going to moderate. So if you have questions to pose to Peter, please send them in a direct chat to Atlanta for consideration during the event. I'm going to curate the questions at the end of the reading so that we can have a lively conversation. And also the chat is open for respectful and your contributions. So we're Zooming from different locations, but this event is hosted by UW-Bothell, which was built upon the unceded homeland of the Willow Sammamish people. Our campus also touches on the shared waters of tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. In addition, this place has been shaped by the labor of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino laborers who built rail lines and worked in crop fields, logging camps, and salmon canneries, and African American workers who worked in shipyards. So what this means for me as an educator and writer living in the region is to commit to learning about the history and culture of these communities, to show solidarity for the continued fight for Indigenous sovereignty, and to work on decolonizing our educational practices, including whose histories, whose stories and lineages we center in our writing practices and education. And I hope is that engaging with this work, that the writers and artists and thinkers who are sharing their work with us in the series, today's talk being one of them, is one contribution to this effort. And I encourage our audience to consider how you can individually and communally contribute to this work in a way that's meaningful to you. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our guest for today. Peter Bacho is the author of 6 books, including Dark Blue Soup, Boxing in Black and White, Leaving Yesler, and I'm really excited to hear from the most recent book, Uncle Rico's Encore, Mostly True Stories of Filipino Seattle. His books have received several awards, including the 1992 American Book Award, and he has taught at Evergreen State College, and then as a child, he lived with his immigrant parents in migrant worker camps, traveling from harvest to harvest. Much of his youth was spent in Seattle's blue-collar and multi-ethnic Central District, a place of hard lives and tough times. He was the first in his family to graduate from high school, then college, and finally law school. These experiences continue to inform his writing. So really excited to pass the mic to you.
Thank you, Ching-Yen. Can everyone hear? Is my volume coming through okay? Okay, that's good. Let me start with something that starts at the beginning, the introduction. And it's interesting that the Harry Bridges Center is kind of the larger center that helps fund these sorts of events, because Harry Bridges, as you know, was the president and much persecuted president of the ILWU, Longshoremen Warehousemen's Union, a very militant union in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, of which my father was a member, the Cannery Workers Union. And I'll start off with this. I mean, I go into it much deeper in one of the stories in the book. Bad Attitude is the name of the story. But because this is also a creative writing class, I'll after I get done with the introduction, I will go to a story that features a bit of creative writing in which I merge the craft of memoir with the craft of fiction, two different disciplines. Okay, this is the introduction. The idea of this collection came to me on my 68th birthday, a time of pause and recollection and an occasional barb. Oi, old goat, you don't look a day over 67. Exactly 50 years earlier, on my 18th birthday, for several hours, I would stand, sit, write, and bend over in the old Army Induction Center on the west side of Queen Anne Hill in Seattle. What happened there on that day would change the course of my life. I hadn't written in years, and I was pleased with my mini memoir, September 20th, 1968. Other small pieces followed, not immediately. I had no book contract deadline to worry about. But over time, when I couldn't shake a memory of Seattle, my hometown, or Chinatown in the central area, or my parents' or my mom's stories, or my uncles and cousins and a host of close friends. My Pinoy friends and I had a lot of common. We were poor or blue collar and American born. Most of us lived in the central area or south end, both working class, multi-ethnic neighborhoods. Some of us lived in the projects, and some of us ran the streets and were quick with our tempers, quick with our fists. English was our first and typically our only language. All of us had Filipino fathers. Not all of us had Filipino mothers. That was no big deal. To us, racial purity didn't matter. We were Pinoys, the bottom line. Our parents, our fathers in particular, had come to this new land of the 1920s and 1930s. They arrived just in time for the Depression and the violent anti-Filipino racism up and down the West Coast, where most of them settled. Our fathers and uncles lived much of their lives in the margins, working dead-end, often back-breaking jobs in California fields and Alaska salmon canneries. The luckier ones cooked or washed dishes in restaurant kitchens in Seattle, Stockton, and Los Angeles. My friends and I knew their stories of racial hostility and violence. But we also knew the stories of resistance, of how they formed militant labor unions to demand higher wages and better working conditions. Certainly that was the case in 1965 when Larry Itliong led Filipino grape pickers off the fields in Delano, California. The Pinoys were later joined by Mexican workers led by the iconic Cesar Chavez. Together, the two groups formed the United Farm Workers and launched the famed strike and grape boycott that same year. But for me, the most successful example of Filipino resistance can be found in the history of Local 37 of the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, the ILWU. That's Bridges' union. Every spring, Seattle-based Local 37 would dispatch thousands of migrant workers, mostly Filipinos, to the Alaska salmon canneries. In the 1950s, during the height of the McCarthy era, the union was led by a communist, my friend Chrisman Salvas. For the federal government, that was a problem. This was the poisonous, paranoid time of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who rose to prominence by playing on America's Cold War fears and providing simple answers in a post-World War II world that was increasingly complex and rapidly changing. McCarthy falsely declared that America was riddled with communists and fellow travelers, and that these, within quotes, traitors, professors, government officials, Hollywood writers, union officials, liberals, were corroding the nation from within. And he had lists of names to prove it. For McCarthy and his ilk, half-truths and lies were his cudgels of choice. Conformity became the rule, and political dissent became treason. Readers should now close their eyes and imagine the irony. A Filipino communist leading a major union during the McCarthy era. Despite the enormous pressure placed on the union by the federal government, Local 37 did not break up or give up its leader. Mensalvas remained president until 1959, 5 years after McCarthy was censured by the Senate, and 2 years after McCarthy's death in 1957. By any standard, this is a remarkable example of ferocious defiance, largely untold and unknown, but remarkable nonetheless. I tell the tale of Local 37 in Bad Attitude, which is included in this story collection. What led these old Pinoys to act as they did when other Americans were rolling over and naming names? Over the years, I've pondered this question, and I think I have some answers. The Filipinos of my dad's era were an especially tough bunch. All had experienced racism and hardship. Many had joined militant labor unions. Many had survived combat. Years of adversity helped to build backbone, their intense pride, their edgy, don't mess with me attitude, and a powerful sense of community. These were distinctive features that marked my father's generation, allowed them to survive in this new and often hostile land. For them, the union's fight with the federal government was just another enemy to confront and overcome. I would like to think that some of those traits have been passed on and absorbed by us, their American-born sons and daughters. Our parents' legacy, that sense of community, is what we inherited. And the bonds that we built over more than 50 years still remain strong. But not all of the stories in this collection are as dramatic as Local 37's stand against the federal government. In fact, most of these stories are devoid of political meaning and historic import, and instead are accounts of smaller, more intimate stories of losing a mother, of remembering her stories and pretending to enjoy her bland, untasty meals, of losing an uncle and good friends, of losing a marriage, of almost losing a life. The longer I live, the more I will lose. That's life. But each morning when I rise, I pause to remember the preciousness of what I have lost, and I cherish it. That's also life. The old Pinoy community of my youth and memory is gone, dispersed by change and movement and the passing of time. Today, there are still Filipinos in Seattle, thousands more, in fact, but many of them arrived after 1968, when US immigration laws were loosened. Unlike my parents' generation, many of these newer arrivals came with college degrees and professional credentials and landed on a much softer spot and a kinder time in the new land. I am sure that they or their children or grandchildren have their own stories to tell. This collection tells mine. I'll go from this to something that kind of ties into the creative writing aspect of it. And in this, I kind of merge two disciplines, memoir or creative nonfiction and fiction writing. It's called The Fishing Man. I like this story. It's a good story. So those of you who aspire to be fiction writers, this is just one model maybe to follow. As a young boy, I loved to read The Fishing Man, from books and newspapers to magazines, especially the magazines, and especially Field and Stream, with its glossy pages on which my 11-year-old eyes could ah and ooh at photos of red-striped, tail-walking trout in their distant and pure Mountain Creek homes. Next came the stories of the intrepid fly-fishing white men who caught and sometimes released them. Nature as it should be. Such noble and beautiful fish, I thought at the time. Such noble and handsome men, none of whom I was sure called Seattle Central area, Chinatown, or South End home. I wanted to join their ranks, but first, I had to research how to become one of them. I grabbed the dog-eared Sears catalog on the coffee table in our living room, skipping past for the first time women's summer beachwear and going straight to the sports section, the realm of the regal Ted Williams. And there he was, Boston's Teddy Baseball himself, fly fishing pole in hand, looking straight at the camera, looking straight at me. Ted winked and smiled. Mr. Williams, I stammered. Forget it, kid, he said. I don't care how many paper routes you have or how much allowance is. This pole just by itself, look at the price, for Christ's sake. You can't afford this. Nope, no way. And then there's the travel. It costs a lot of money to get to Montana or Idaho or Wyoming, where the pretty fish live. No way. I nodded. The great William stared at me fondly, like maybe he was worried that speaking an obvious truth had hurt my feelings, or like maybe this conversation mattered. He smiled. Hey, kid, how old are you anyway? 11, but I'll be 12 in a couple of... Ted chuckled, cutting me off. Hey, don't feel bad. When I was your age, I couldn't afford this either. My mom, she's Mexican. Bet you didn't know that. Ted frowned and shook his head. You know, back in my day, being Mexican in San Diego wasn't easy, but I lucked out. There was baseball, of course, and I was better than anyone else. But Williams? Hey, just like any Anglo name, right? So I had it a little easier. No, what about you, kid? You're what? Filipino? I thought so. Plenty of those where I come from, hardworking, friendly, nose in the dirt, sweating out in the fields every damn summer day, just like Mexicans. And just like Mexicans, they born poor, they die poor. Hell, none of them are rich, at least not the ones I knew. Ted closed his eyes. Again, he shook his head. I was lucky, kid, he said softly. Baseball, my last name. Got to avoid much of that. He took a deep breath before refocusing on me. You love baseball? Yes, sir. You love fishing? Yes, sir. What do you use? Oh, a hand line, I replied. My dad and me on Sundays after Mass, we go to the docks west of downtown on Elliott Bay and jig for shiners. Sometimes we get lucky and catch a perch. It's fun. Dad says he did this a lot during the Depression. And sometimes on Saturday, if we ain't playing ball or something, me and my pals, a bunch of us, we just hop the two Madrona, get off downtown, walk to the dock, and do the same thing. Ted nodded, approving. Well, it's not stream fishing for browns in Montana, that's for sure, but it's a start. A lot of poor boys get started that way. And what you need now is a pole, just not a fly pole. And you can get one cheap, or at least cheaper. And all you gotta do is toss the bait from shore where the bigger fish are and just sit back and wait. Thanks, Mr. Williams, I said before closing the catalog. I turned and walked out of the room. Anytime, kid, I heard him say. I needed a pole, Mr. Williams told me. How to get one? Now that was another issue. I knew that the basic fishing pole spinning reel combos at Chubby and Tubby out on Rainier ran about $20. Not expensive, much less than fly fishing gear. But at that moment, $20 was 20 more than I had. It was a sunny late April afternoon, so I walked outside and sat on the front steps. My young mind was focused, buried in thought as I raced past the list of money-generating choices. Weekly allowance, not enough. Borrow money from friends, broke like me. Lawn mowing for neighbors, allergic to grass, more allergic to manual labor. What then? The answer came the next afternoon, Saturday, when my favorite uncle, Kikoy, dropped by the house. Rico Don, my dad's cousin, lived in a shabby Chinatown hotel, a cramped one-room hot plate walk-up. As kids, Dad and he had come to this new land together, all full of hope. But in the decades since, they'd lived their lives in America's dark margins, West Coast fields and Alaska's canneries, working dead-end, back-breaking jobs. But unlike Dad, Kikoy had never married. He didn't have much money. As a cannery worker, that was a given, and even I knew that. But what he did earn, he spent on nice clothes, nice whores, and me. Over the years, he treated me as his chosen son, not just a nephew. When I was young, Uncle Rico was my benefactor and my babysitter. He taught me how to curse. When he babysat me, he'd get dressed up, complete with crisp dress shirt and Borsalino hat. And we would prowl his favorite Chinatown haunts full of other old Pinoys. Like Rico, they were all nattily dressed, serenely confident, and speaking different languages, their words sounding like notes. They were glad to be together. They were glad to be alive. And why not? Many, like Rico, were combat veterans. All of them had survived hard times and racial hatred. Yet here they were, decades later, still joking and laughing and living in a land that didn't want them. On me, these old Filipinos left an impression. That's what I want to be when I grow up. From these Pinoys, I first heard cocksucker, son of a bitch, motherfucker. They were among Rico's favorites, his friends too, and were usually bellowed at the pool hall or at a card table in the Victory Bathhouse on King. Uncle Rico was also my beloved giver of gifts and surprises, and lucky me, today was no exception. Dad and he were sitting at the kitchen table, chatting and laughing, eating apple pie and drinking coffee with lots of cream and sugar. As usual, I was camped nearby in the living room in front of our tiny black and white, watching a show with a white boy and his horse, or maybe a collie. I forget which. "Oi, boy," Dad commanded, "come here." I rose and walked toward them. "Your uncle, he did well at the track." Kikoy smiled and nodded. "Really good," he said as he rubbed his hands together. "Hit the trifecta first time all my years going, boy, oh boy." "You want to give you something," Dad said. Uncle Rico reached under the table and handed me a new two-piece fiberglass rod, complete with spin cast reel with a covered front and its snazzy newfangled push-button release. I recognized it too, a Zebco combination that I'd first seen in the fishing gear aisle at Chubby and Tubby. It caught my eye. A black beauty, I thought, but more than my folks could afford. And just like that, now it was mine. My jaw dropped. "Oh, wow," I mumbled. Dad looked at me sternly. "Boy, you got something else to say?" "Thank you, Uncle Rico. Thank you," he giggled, then extended his right hand palm up and shook it, his wordless way of saying, "It was nothing, kid, nothing." But to me, it was not nothing. From that day on, if I had free time and wasn't playing baseball or going to school, I was on my bike, the priceless Zebco dismantled and tethered to the crossbar, pedaling hard to some secret or not so secret spot on the Seattle side of Lake Washington. In those days, the lake was polluted. the destination of untreated human waste. But being a kid, I just didn't care. It didn't look polluted, especially on clear early mornings when the lake glistened with the snow-capped cascades in the background. Health concerns settled. Off on my bike I'd go on more days than not. From our little house in the central area, it's about 3 miles to Lake Washington. For me and my young legs, an easy stretch by any measure. But it may as well have been 300. Across the street from the lake were the mansions and fancy houses of Seattle's best. The ghost people, the white movers and shakers who ran the city. They were rarely seen, at least not by folks in the central area. But I wasn't curious about them at all. Their great houses and great wealth, their large lives and grand dreams, their glittering futures or heroic past. All I knew was that rich folks didn't own the lake, and they didn't own the view. In my grade school years of fishing the lake, before I was consumed by high school sports, my favorite spot was the dock next to Madison Beach. For me, it wasn't the most productive, but that's where I met the fishing man, a stocky and older African American. Every time I went to that spot, he was there, sitting on a folding chair, bending forward if it was cold, leaning back if it wasn't. He wasn't a man of many words, so intent was he on catching fish. But over time, we sometimes chatted. One afternoon, he told me he was born in Louisiana, came up during the war, served in the Pacific, and returned to Seattle, settling here. Before he retired, he'd worked the shipyards. Then his wife died, and his kids grew up and moved away. Why Seattle? I asked. He looked at me. Louisiana, he answered. Hard place to be if you colored. One day, late afternoon, I arrived at the dock. The fishing man had already caught a mess of perch, many more than usual. I watched him reel in his line and rebait the hook, worm and salmon eggs, staples. Then he added a small marshmallow. Perch eat marshmallows? These ones do, he replied. He stood and cast as far as he could, then settled into his chair. Eat this, bitches, I heard him mumble. Almost 60 years later, I am sitting on a dock on American Lake near my home outside Tacoma. I carefully bait the hook, worm, salmon eggs, and marshmallow, a food combination not normally found in nature. But it works. And for me, that's the bottom line. I cast out and hear the plunk and watch the ripple. I tighten the line. This morning in early May is warm, so I sit back and relax. And then a fleeting memory, a glimpse, field and stream and the white fly fishing men. Nope, I never became one of them. Then I take out a Camel, I light it, welcome the first drag and smile. My eyes focus on the tip of the pole. Eat this, bitches, I say. I guess I can end right there, unless you want me to read one more. But we should do Q&A, shouldn't we?
We can open it up, and then maybe if we have time, if you want.
If we have time, yeah, good.
More. So just a reminder for folks, if you have questions, please direct message them to Atlanta, and we'll consider them for the conversation. Thank you so much, Peter, for reading the intro, a little bit of context, or like a little peek into creating this new book, and then one of the stories. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you mentioned just briefly about how you're combining fiction writing techniques with nonfiction.
Well, I mean, I had X number of decades as a fiction writer, and there's a line in 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 uh, uh, The Things They Carried, a wonderful book by Tim O'Brien, in which he essentially says, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. And I thought in The Fishing Man, I had a metaphor for the directions for the way I chose to live my life. That is that my initial dream was to become one of the fly fishing men. At the end, that's not a road that I took. And to tell this story, I mean, that's why it's mostly true stories, right? I mean, I give the reader a fair warning that most of these stories are true. Fishing Man obviously is one that more fictional than anything else, although elements of it are quite true. But I think combining the genres of creative nonfiction and fiction, to me, was an interesting task.
Was there anything that you found really challenging? I mean, it sounds like maybe bending the truth a little bit to make a good story.
No, there really wasn't, because I loved the story. I mean, I loved this project, and other works that I've done. It was always much more of a wrestling match, 2.5, 3 years, a wrestling match. But these were stories I was intimately familiar with, and it's not just a story of myself and my family, but it's a story, the collected stories of an entire community and an entire era. I love the stories. It was a joy to write, to be honest.
How long did it take you to put this collection together?
2.5 maybe years from September 20th, 1968, which is the first story. And I liked it so much that I said, well, maybe I should get back to writing again. And, about 8-10 stories down the road, I contacted UW Press. And because both Cebu and Dark Blue Suit had done very well for them, they said, sure. And I was working with Mike Backham, the editor at UW Press. And it was a very smooth relationship. It was the smoothest relationship I've ever had with an editor. It was very good.
I think some of our students, might be looking down the line at putting together a collection. Can you talk a little bit about what that editing process was like?
Depends on I think it depends on your skill level, to be honest. And like I said, I had 20 years of fiction writing, and so the editing process was relatively. It was painless. It was painless. He made a handful of edits, and that was about it. But that's not necessarily going to be the case for a beginning writer. If the editor sees the potential in a manuscript, but also sees some glaring flaws, then you're going to have to be able to work through those flaws with your editor. That's the difference between starting out and having been there.
So I see some questions from the labor stories class.
Mhm.
How do you determine the type of voice you want characters to have?
I listen very carefully. I mean, in this, I try to hear their voices and record them on paper as best as I recall. I listen very, very well.
Do you ever show the voices, the folks whose voices you're presenting, what you've written and kind of get a response, or do you just kind of put it out there?
I just kind of put it out there. Yeah, but for people whose names I've mentioned, I always run it by them. Like there's a story on boxing called Van the Man, and he was our coach. and he passed away in 2015. And my friend Ted Davino, who's featured in many of these stories, I ran it by him. Is this as you recall it? Is this what we said, or approximating what we said? And he said, yep. So, you know, I get confirmation that way, because this is a memoir. That was a story that was completely true. This one here, there was a fishing man, but there was no Ted Williams that appeared. I just thought it would add to the story.
Okay, so I actually think this question from the class goes in line with what you were just saying. How do you know a story is worth writing?
You have to love it. If it doesn't leave you, you have to love it. Otherwise, you know, go off and do something more productive. And that's my rule. You know, I'm not gonna. Writing is a focus. I mean, and although this one came very easy, it was primarily because I really loved the story. Like I said, it's not just a story of myself and my screw ups, of which there are many, and of my family. It's not that small. It's a story of a community at a particular time in the city that I still love very deeply. So these are things that made the writing process, the remembering process, very smooth, very easy for me.
I see a question from the audience. How much humor did you find in these stories, and did that surprise you?
How much?
Humor.
Oh, quite a bit, quite a bit. There's a story in Eulogy, in which, and this is a true story too, in which time I was 3 years old, and it's a eulogy about my mother. And my mom and I were very close. When I was 3 years old, I was she found me in the bathroom, and I was pushing and, you know, groaning and pushing, and I was sitting on the stool, and she says, "Don't push so hard." And I said, "Why is that, Mom?" "Because if you push too hard, your stomach will come out." So the next day, I remember, I'm 3 years old, a bunch of Filipinos are gathered in my folks' house, and they're just, you know, having a little get together full of food and conversation and what have you. So I walk over to my mom, I drop my pants, and I say, "Mom, can you check, has my stomach come out?" And she says, "No, you're okay. Go eat some lumpia." That's a true story. Or that there's one in terms of a story later on. This is a true story too. Guilt. It's the title of the story is Guilt, in which my basic intention is that guilt, Catholic guilt, Filipino guilt, you name it, you're raised in it, and at age 8 or 9, there was a Pope guy by the name of Pius XII. And he died, and somehow or another, I was sitting in church. I had been convinced in my own little screwed up 9-year-old Catholic Filipino mind that I must have murdered him, that I was the one responsible for his death. I carried that around for a long time. Oh no, until I went to confession, and the priest says, "No, he didn't. He was old. He died on his own." But so, and here, I'll read you a sample of that in terms of guilt.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Let's see, I have to find it. Okay. I say that it was the high octane fuel. Guilt was the high octane fuel that drove me. Okay, well, just a little section. I loved my late mother, Remedios, and she loved me. Ours was a special sacred bond. But that didn't stop her from yanking my invisible and umbilical chain when she saw the need arise. Don't forget, you're the oldest, Mom told me after one of my many lapses. You will always have an obligation. For what, Mom? To do right, to make it work, to set an example. I remember one day in particular, a Thursday night near the end of the quarter. I was living in Tacoma then and teaching at the University of Washington branch campus. I was relaxed, ready to go to bed, but then the telephone rang. I picked up the receiver. I should not have answered. Manong Peter, my sister Irma said, I bought you a ticket for Reno. A morning flight, 7, okay? Huh? Irma explained that Norris, the middle sibling, was in trouble again. He'd been a high-ranking city official, but had had a very public fallout with his bosses. Now he was in jail, busted for forging drug prescriptions. Irma had tried to find him a lawyer, but no one wanted the job. Irma's husband, Leo, she said, would meet me in the terminal with a ticket and enough money to bail Norris out and to find an attorney. I took a deep breath. I've always had a hard time saying no to my sister. I can't, Irma. I finally said, I still got all these papers to read. Then there's finals coming up next week. And besides that, for most of his life, he was always screwing up. And the families always bailed him out. I paused. Always. I said, my voice started to rise. But not this time, baby. No way. This mess ain't on me. It ain't on us. Manong Peter, Irma whined. No. Then my mother got on the line. She was crying. Mom, Peter, she said between sobs, he's your only brother. Damn, I thought, a mother-sister double team. This ain't even fair. At 7:30 the next morning, I'm doing what I usually do, sipping coffee and reading the New York Times. The flight is on schedule. I'm Reno bound. That's an effing true story.
Thank you so much. Listening to you, and I see this, I see a comment in the chat about just all of the voices that you've captured. Do you have any advice for folks who are writing dialogue?
Listen carefully.
Listen carefully.
And each speaker, each character has a different way of speaking. You're gonna have to capture that and put it on paper. Okay, because I mean, in film, every character is going to speak differently. They're not all going to speak the King's English unless you're watching Downton Abbey or something like that, which I haven't done yet. But you want to capture how well the character speaks, so that there's a distinction in the reader's voice, and if you can establish the distinction that so and so sounds like this and the other person sounds like this, you can do away with the identifiers. John said, Jim added, Morris replied, etc., because the reader will know. And sometimes these identifiers just get in the way of the flow of dialogue, right? And you know, dialogue is what brings a page alive. Oftentimes, I mean, there's a narrative also, but one of the things that beginning fiction writing students, they make a mistake in this because they over rely upon narrative, and the reason for the over reliance on narrative, I've found out over the years, is because it resembles composition, which is something we all have been taught since grade 1 to do, right? Break yourself of that habit. Break yourself of that habit, and give your characters more depth. What I make them come alive, at least in terms of the reader being able to hear the voices. What I tell students at the beginning of any creative writing class that I do teach, is that with a pad of paper and a pen, you can create a scene as vivid as anything you've ever seen on the screen, whether you're talking about Ace operas or the Normandy landing and Saving Private Ryan, which was very, very visual. You can do the same thing with a pad, and it's a lot cheaper than trying to do it in a movie with a pad and a pen. But the secret to that, I think, is detail. Because if I say fruit, it can be anything. But if I say Washington Red Delicious, that's something else. You see that. You see that. So be very specific in your choice of words. And if you're very specific in your choice of words, you can create a scene that's very effective and very, very visual. And that triggers that projector in the mind that careful readers have.
I see a question from the audience. I think this is in response to your Downton Abbey comment. What's a
Yeah.
book, TV show, or a movie that you've enjoyed you think would surprise us? And what was valuable to you about that?
What's the question?
What's a book, TV show, or movie that you've enjoyed you think would surprise us? And what was wonderful, valuable to you about that? I can also put it in the chat too, so you can see them.
I think two of the there's I can go with two of my favorite movies of all time, The Godfather and Reservoir Dogs. But that's Quentin's first, and the reason that I can go back and watch Reservoir Dogs is because it upset my notion of who's good and who's bad. I walked out of the theater and I'm saying, oh man, who's the good guy here and who's the bad guy here? Now, that's when you know that Tarantino hit this level of art. And so when he makes you can't get it out of your head. There was a French import that ran on Netflix called The Bureau. And it was the equivalent of the French CIA. And the protagonist was always deeply conflicted. And in the scene that still kind of stays with me, in the end, he has to face, in his dreams, he has to face a table full of people whose lives he destroyed. It was very effective. It was haunting. Well worth the it was well worth the time that I devoted to following that very carefully. Anything that makes you stop and think, anything that there's a line in Tim O'Brien's The Things I Carried, in which the young Tim O'Brien objects to the war. He's just been accepted for graduate school, but he's subject to the draft. And he's on the Rainy River, which separates Minnesota, his home, from Canada. He's about 10 yards away from 10 yards away from the shoreline. And the old guy that he's with is just kind of fishing there and just kind of minding his own business, knowing full well that this is probably Tim's chance to escape. And in the end, he couldn't go overboard. And he couldn't go overboard because he was too afraid to be brave. For him, bravery would have been telling the draft board to go screw yourself. This is an unjust war. He opposed the war. But he couldn't make himself be brave. He would submit to the draft because he couldn't stand the ridicule. The truly brave Tim O'Brien, he tells us, would have said no to the draft. And that was jarring in terms of my sense of courage. Courage, as you typically think of courage being the young man out in the bush with a gun, shooting at things, getting shot at, shooting at the enemy, getting shot at. But in Tim's concept of right and wrong, the truly courageous thing for him to have done would have been to say no to the draft and to be willing to endure the public ridicule of the small town that he lived in for telling the government, no, you're wrong, this is an unjust war. That made me rethink things. And anything that makes you rethink things, makes you think of a work of art, whether it's a book or a movie, long after you've closed or finished the movie or finished the last page, the artist, whether it's the director, actors, or the writer, has done his or her job and has achieved some level of art. That's one of my standards for art. Did it make me rethink things?
Thank you. I think we just have a few more minutes left. So if there are any burning questions that you didn't get to ask, now would be the time. This is a story. This is a question from the class. How can fictional and expressive elements in a nonfiction story encourage readers to become more invested?
How can they?
How can they?
Okay. I would start out with not plotting. I would start out with the creation of a multi-layered protagonist, because this is your Brad Pitt, right? What are his strengths? What are his weaknesses? I mean, beginning writers will oftentimes, and I found this, and I've actually done a video on it. I'll put it in the chat, how to start building a great protagonist. And then just put after that Bacho, and that should take you to that. A beginning writer oftentimes will base the protagonist upon himself or herself. That tends to narrow the outcome. Okay, the protagonist has to succeed because the writer subconsciously can't see him or herself failing. Well, how about a failing is more interesting, right? I mean, it precludes certain sorts of plotting options, storyline options. Failure may be more artistically interesting than, the hero quest, where the hero succeeds against all great odds, et cetera, falls first of all, and then bounces back to overcome these enormous odds and is eventually very successful. Think through your character. Yeah, to a certain degree, it's going to reflect you, but go beyond what you know about yourself and experiment. What if, in terms of your protagonist? So that's my suggestion. Start off with a captivating, fascinating protagonist. Build your protagonist. Start off with that and worry about the plot later. Because it opens up all kinds of plotting options, right? What if the hero doesn't quite make it, just falls just short? Then what? I mean, this is life, right? This is life. Okay. So I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you. I think the last question I'll ask you, to close it out, is since I know you shared a lot of advice, but do you have any parting words for, our emerging writers in the room?
Yeah. Love what you're doing. It'll make the process a lot easier. I've decided now at this advanced stage that if I don't like a project, I'm not going to do it. And, be easy on yourself. For me, I write when the muse grabs me by my hair and says, "You're going to have to write this." But other than that, I'm just normal old me. Right? No big deal. I don't worry about stuff. Right? If I feel like going out for a drink or watching sports instead of writing, that's what I am most of the time. But once the project is underway and I'm in love with the project, writing is a relatively simple thing. You got to love something in order to do it well, my opinion. A project as personal as a collection or some other type of creative nonfiction or fiction, you have to love it. There are other ways you can be successful, but for me, at least as a writer, you have to love what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks for reading your work and sharing all this wisdom about the writing life. And I know that it was put in the chat earlier, but if you don't have a copy of Uncle Rico's Encore, please pick it up from University of Washington Press, just out. And just if you're not linked up on we do have a listserv where we kind of let you know about future events. This is the last event for this for the speaker series, but next week the students in the class are going to be telling their own stories in a speculative world building project, and that's been put in the chat. So you can come in person if you're on Bothell campus to UW 1060, and it's 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. next Tuesday, May 31st. We will buy you lunch, and or we also have a Zoom option. So if you're interested in that, there's a link there that you can sign up for the Zoom link. And then there's also a website link if you want to look up any of the future events that we're going to be having. So with that, I want to thank Peter so much for visiting us today virtually.
Thank you.
Thank
you
so
very much. Well, thank you.
Thank you. And then if you're in the class, we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back. So, and everybody else, I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Chingen. I'll go ahead and fill out that paperwork too and get it going.
Sounds good. Bye.
Okay.
All.
Bye-bye.
Yes.